Saint Joseph, pure and gentle, guardian of the Saviour child, treading with the Virgin Mother, Egypt's deserts rough and wild. Hail Saint Joseph, spouse of Mary, blessed above all saints on high. With your gentle understanding, teach us how to live like thee. Teach us how to live like thee.
Evening and welcome everybody, and a very warm welcome whether you're here in the church, which isn't that warm, or whether you're watching on the live stream. And a very special welcome this evening to our speaker, Dr Jessie Rogers, who has come to us from Ireland. Jessie lectures in Scripture at St Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth and is the director of the Centre for Mission and Ministries. She's also a founding member of the Tarsus Scripture School, which offers online scripture programs, and Godly Play Ireland, which offers spiritual accompaniment for children. Originally, she is from South Africa. She is married and has 3 daughters. Jessie, on behalf of the South Bucks Pastoral area, I'm delighted to welcome you here this evening to St Joseph's Parish. My first encounter with Jessie was when I listened to the talks that she gave for the foundation weekend of the Called and Equipped programme in our diocese. And I was particularly struck by her talk on the calling of St. Paul. We're very much looking forward to hearing your reflection on the story of Ruth and Naomi, both members of a family who made their home in Bethlehem. So it seems particularly appropriate talk to start our Advent season. Thank you, Jessie.
So, is my voice at the right pitch? It really is good to be with you this evening. I have to admit it's the first time I've been in this part of the UK, and the little bit I've seen, absolutely beautiful. And I'm also, the people I've met so far, beautiful, friendly, welcoming people as well. So what I'm going to be looking at tonight is the story of Ruth. Now, it's probably a story you know. It would be interesting. I know I can't see those of you, and you're very welcome, those of you who are following online or listening back later. But I would be interested just to have a show of hands. Who feels they kind of know the story of Ruth? Kind of. It's one of those stories that we do come across. It's an absolutely, it's a short story. It's a story that covers a whole lot. And in particular, I'm looking at it tonight as a story of surprising faithfulness. First of all, a couple of introductory comments about the book itself. It's a short story in 4 acts. So in our Bibles, it'll be in 4 chapters. So it means it doesn't take at all long to read. In the Jewish tradition, it's one of the megalot, one of the scrolls. 5 of the short little books that we find in the Hebrew Bible are read at different festivals. And the book of Ruth is read at Shavuot, which perhaps you've heard of, the Festival of Weeks. It's kind of corresponds to our Pentecost because it's 50 days after Passover. And as you're listening to the story and as we're reflecting on it, see if you can work out why would it make sense to hear this story at Shavuot, which is a pilgrim festival to mark the end of the wheat harvest. And in rabbinic tradition, it also is the day on which the law was given to Moses at Sinai. Just one more comment before we dive in, and that is that even though we call it the Book of Ruth, if you look at how the story is told, I think it's really Naomi's story. It begins with Naomi, and it ends with a child that is born being placed on her lap. So you'll see I'll be giving as much, maybe even more attention to Naomi than to Ruth. Okay, so how does this story begin? It begins with a family leaving Bethlehem. That name, Bethlehem, literally is house of bread. So it begins quite ironically, where you have a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah goes to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. Now, that may just seem like a sensible thing to do. If you live in this place that's called the house of bread, but there is no bread, then you become one of the refugees, one of the migrants who moves elsewhere in search of a living. What is striking here, though, is that they go to the country of Moab. The people of God did not like the people of Moab. In fact, in the book of Deuteronomy, it's one of the laws that Moses recounts says that a Moabite may never join the assembly, meaning the people of God gathered together to worship, may never join the assembly even down to the 10th generation. So the Moabites are outsiders. They are the despised, hated outsiders. But if you're starving, if you need a new way, if you need a new life, if you need a way of surviving, you have to go wherever you can find what looks like life. We aren't told how Naomi felt about this, but we are told that Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they'd lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. So this attempt at finding new life in Moab had gone horribly wrong. 10, 15 years into her life there, she has no husband, she has no sons, she simply has 2 daughters-in-law. And then we're told that she starts to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab because she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she hears that God has been gracious to the people back in Bethlehem, and she decides to go. We're not left wondering very long how Naomi feels about this. Because what she does as she starts on her way back, this is not what I have in my mind when I think of the Advent journey to Bethlehem, but she is on a journey back to Bethlehem. As she begins, she starts to think, what is it going to look like when I arrive back in Bethlehem with these 2 Moabite women? And so she says to them, go back, each of you, to your mother's house. And she pronounces a blessing on them. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each in the house of your husband. So she's saying, go back to your old way of life. Making it clear that her experience of Orpah and of Ruth has been of people who were kind and faithful and generous to her. When they don't want to go, then I kind of imagine Naomi's mask slips a little bit. Because when they say they won't go, we see some of what's going on inside Naomi. She says, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? And then she just gives vent to her sense of hopelessness, her sense of frustration. She reckons there is nothing more for her in life. So she says, do I still have sons in my womb that I can give you husbands? And, even if I could, you'd have to wait an awful long time before you could marry them. And she says, even if I thought there was hope for me. And clearly she doesn't. She says, even if I thought there was hope. She is hopeless. And then she says, no, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. Now we're beginning to see how Naomi has interpreted her own story. Was God angry that they left Bethlehem and went to the abominable Moabites? Well, when your husband dies, and then first one son and then the other, when death and tragedy hit your family, it's not surprising that Naomi says, "The hand of the Lord has turned against me." So Naomi, as she begins to go back to to Bethlehem, is hopeless. She feels that God is against her. Just to say, and I hope whatever else you do, I hope by the end of this evening you're going to say, "I need to read that story again." If you go and you read the story again, watch out for what God does and watch out for what people say about God. Now, I will tell you at the end the one thing that God actually is said to do. For the rest, we hear what people think God is at. And what Naomi thinks God is at is God's hand is against her. God is judging her. And so Orpah, her one daughter-in-law, decides to go back. Ruth says, "I won't go back." Naomi tries her best. She said, "Your sister-in-law has gone back. Why don't you go back too?" And then we have what is perhaps the best known part of the story of Ruth. Ruth's commitment. I've heard this more than once read at weddings. "Do not press me to leave you, to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." I'm told that one way that one can propose in Ireland is to ask somebody if they would like to be buried with your people. Ruth's commitment here, can you see, is to Naomi. Naomi had earlier said how much Ruth had been good to her and to her deceased sons. Ruth obviously knows enough about God through Naomi to know that she'll be able to live with this God and with Naomi's people. But her first and her strongest commitment is to Naomi. This is somebody who loves her mother-in-law and who has decided it doesn't matter what happens, she will stay with her. I don't know how you would expect Naomi to respond to that. Literally. Oh, sorry. My apologies. I'm going forward on my slide, and I haven't been giving you the slide. So that's a piece about Naomi's helplessness, and here I'm talking about Ruth's commitment. The way we're told Naomi responds to this is when she realized there was nothing she could say, she said no more. So they just continue in silence. She just goes completely silent, says not a word, and the two of them keep walking. When Ruth and Naomi arrive in Bethlehem, we're told that everybody was excited and also amazed. Unfortunately, I have had this experience where you haven't seen someone for a good number of years, and you can tell by the look that you get that they're trying not to show it, but it's like, oh my word, she's got old. And it was like, can this be Naomi? And as her family and friends are welcoming her back, this is what she says. "Call me no longer Naomi." The word Naomi means pleasant. Call me Mara. The word Mara means bitterness. and I've highlighted there. Can you hear how she is interpreting her experience in the light of her faith? And the way she's doing it is to say, God is punishing me. Because she says, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me pleasant when the Lord has dealt harshly with me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? Can you see how the experiences that Naomi has had have left her bitter? So much so she's saying, call me bitter. And how she is projecting that onto God. She's saying, well, I don't know, did she have a choice? Did Elimelech, her husband, kind of discuss it with her? Did they decide together, or was she felt she had to go to Moab? Was it okay? Well, the way she's interpreted it is, no, they clearly did the wrong thing, and God's hand is against them. For me, one of the saddest parts about this, it's the end of chapter 1, is she says, the Lord has brought me back empty. And who's standing next to her? Ruth. Ruth the Moabite is standing next to her, and she says nothing about Ruth. I can imagine Ruth standing there kind of like, hi. And Naomi's reading of this all is she has lost everything. She probably felt that Ruth was like an albatross around her neck. Ruth is the reminder that she had left Bethlehem to go to Moab, something which God was obviously, in her interpretation, unhappy with. And so the fact that she's back in Bethlehem and she has this Moabite woman with her, I can just imagine, you know the story of the ancient mariner and the albatross around his neck. So the first part of Naomi's story is of a, should we call her a refugee or maybe an economic migrant whose journey went horribly wrong, who's returned, and she's returned with Ruth. Now again, if you're going to go and read it, notice how in the first chapter she's just called Ruth. What we're told, that she's a Moabite, but then she's just called Ruth. From the beginning of chapter 2, from when they get back to Bethlehem, she will be Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite, Ruth the Moabite. The storyteller doesn't need to tell us that. We already have that information. This is the storyteller's way of reminding us that she's now in a milieu where that's what everybody notices. She is the outsider from that detested people. Now, once they get to Bethlehem, Ruth says to Naomi, let me go and glean in the fields. Gleaning was a way that poor people were able to look after themselves. You could go into somebody's field and you could pick up whatever was dropped. So Ruth says, let me do this. And what happens then, and here we see, we're not told that it's anything other than a coincidence, that Ruth ends up in a field working, picking up things, picking up the wheat that is falling, and the owner of the field comes. And this owner, Boaz, is obviously a very, very holy, righteous person. He walks in and he greets everybody by blessing them, and they bless him in return. And he notices this very attractive young girl who is gathering wheat in his field. And he says to her, Now listen, my daughter, don't go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young woman. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. I'm going to come back to this, but I've sometimes heard the book of Ruth described as this beautiful story that has no villain in it and kind of no real danger. Well, clearly, even though she was allowed to do it before the Me Too age, she's vulnerable. She needs to stick with the woman. And then we're actually told that Boaz tells the men, don't you dare touch her. And then he, in fact, says to them, pull out extra so that she can gather more. And she is so aware, Ruth, that she's a foreigner. So she says, why have I found favor in your sight? And Boaz says, look, I've heard how you look after Naomi so well. How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. So if you can, just remember that piece where he says, may God reward you under whose wings you've come for refuge. Because Ruth is going to very gently but powerfully call him out on that. Then there's something that begins to happen in Naomi at this point. On this slide, I've given you what she says when Ruth first of all says to her, let me go to the field and glean behind someone in whose sight I might find favor. Her only answer is, go, my daughter. Ruth is somebody who is committed to Naomi, so she's going to do whatever she can to help the two of them survive. The second part comes from later in the chapter, after Ruth has met Boaz, and because Boaz is smitten with her already, she was given a lot of extra stuff. They made sure she had plenty to gather. And when Naomi sees this, she says, where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And then when she hears that it's Boaz, then she's delighted, and she says, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The man is a relative of ours, one of our near kin. And then she goes on to say, it's better, my daughter, because Ruth says to her, and he told me to stay with his manservants, with his male servants. And you can see something's come alive again in Naomi, because now she starts to care for Ruth, because she says, it's better, my daughter, that you go out with a young woman, which is actually what Boaz had said as well. Otherwise, you might be bothered in another field. So can you see how Naomi is starting to care for Ruth? But look at what she says about God. She says, blessed be he by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So she's beginning to realize that maybe God isn't against her. Dealt bitterly with me, brought me back empty, dealt harshly with me, brought calamity on me. Now she's saying, the Lord's kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. And why is she able to say that? It's because of what Ruth has done and what Boaz has done. So the kindness of those around her, she's interpreting as the kindness of the Lord. So, for another harvest, She continues to gather. But then after the wheat harvest and then the barley harvest, they'd run out of harvests. And now, for me, there's something that's happened to Naomi. Something has really come alive in her again. Because now she says, my daughter, I need to seek some security for you so that it may be well with you. She's come a long way, hasn't she, from when she didn't even acknowledge Ruth standing with her. And what she does, Naomi says, listen, Boaz, look, I'm going to paraphrase. Boaz is besotted with you. We know because he is an upstanding Israelite man, he probably is not going to make the first move on a Moabite woman. So what you need to do is go to the threshing floor, snuggle up, and see what he'll do. Now, I have heard people say, oh, this was a kind of sort of a betrothal or a way one kind of asked, the way a woman asked a man out. No, the only people who would be at the threshing floor at the end of the harvest when everyone had had too much to drink were the prostitutes. So Ruth actually is being encouraged by Naomi to play the prostitute, gambling on Boaz's good character. She kind of knows that Boaz is obviously very attracted to Ruth, but somehow he needs to be kind of forced or encouraged to take that extra step. And so this is what Ruth does. But it looks to me that Naomi, at this point, is only concerned for Ruth. And she's saying, look, I know that you can be looked after because he can marry you. When Ruth gets there, Ruth is actually concerned for Naomi. When, having had slightly too much to drink, Boaz is woken up in the middle of the night by a woman lying against his legs, he wakes up with a fright and says, who's this? And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. So, do you remember I said way back to remember what Boaz first said to her? He said, may the Lord spread his wings over you. The word for wing and the word for cloak is the same word. It's his kanaf. So it's kind of like Ruth is saying to Boaz, put your money where your mouth is. It's wonderful that the Lord can spread his cloak or his wing over me, but actually I need you to do it. I need you to actually rescue me. And then she also says, for you are next of kin. He's not actually next of kin to her, he's next of kin to Naomi. So what's probably happening here is that Naomi is concerned for Ruth. So Naomi is saying, you go and make an unorthodox proposal, and because he is not the kind of guy who'll just sleep with you and let you go, you'll be safe. Whereas for Ruth, it's you are Naomi's next of kin. Therefore, act as the kinsman redeemer. Because Naomi actually owned a field or had owned a field which had been sold. So Ruth is asking Boaz to look after Naomi. If you want to know, was it okay for Ruth to be there? Well, Boaz is very concerned that she gets home before anybody can recognize who she is. He is concerned for her reputation. Sorry, and once again, I'm forgetting to show you the correct slide. I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. I'm maybe being a little bit unfair to Boaz, but he strikes me as he's a very nice guy. Every time he speaks, he's very religious sounding, and he's blessing everybody, and that's why there's a piece of me that thinks she's saying, yeah, look, put your money where your mouth is. Like, your blessings are wonderful. Thank you for saying that God will look after me, but basically, I need a little bit more than a vague, may God look after me. I actually need you to step in and do something. The only reason he wouldn't, to this point, would have been because she was a Moabite. And then, at this point, when she gets back to Naomi, you can see Naomi has taken such a journey. Naomi is so much more hopeful now. She comes to her mother-in-law who says, how did things go with you, my daughter? She told him all that the man had done and said, look, he gave me these 6 measures of barley. And this is interesting because it doesn't say that Boaz said this, but she says, he said, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Literally, do not go back to your mother-in-law empty. Are you remembering when we've had empty before? When she'd first arrived, with Ruth standing next to her, she was saying, the Lord has brought me back empty. And Ruth is saying, look, you're not empty. Look how much I have brought you. And then Naomi says, wait, my daughter, until you learn what the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And then you have a little bit of back and forth. The man, Boaz, first of all, needs to, there is somebody who's closer, who could redeem the field, who could buy back the field, when he has to offer it to him. But then he just throws in, and by the way, I'm going to marry Ruth. And when he does that, well, then the guy doesn't want to buy back the field, and then Naomi's descendants, there's another child who can take it. So he says, well, that's fine. You can have them both. And so it ends up that everybody thinks that Boaz is wonderful. Nobody seems to mind at the end that he's married a Moabite. And here, I know I said to look at it, but go and double check and see if I'm right. This is the one time that we are actually told that God did something. So it was Naomi who heard that God had been gracious. Naomi is saying that God is gracious or not gracious. And this is the one thing we're actually told that God does. Boaz takes Ruth, she becomes his wife. And when they come together, the Lord makes her conceive, and she bears a son. So that's the one thing we do know that God does in the story, is he gives to this foreign woman a child. And the story ends with Naomi's joy. One thing I love about the book of Ruth, it's a very matriarchal kind of a book. After Abimelech has chosen to take his family to Moab and everything went wrong, it's that when Naomi speaks about Orpah and Ruth's family, she says, go back to the house of your mother. And now what we have here is it's the women who are saying to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. And I love these words. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. So speaking about the child, for your daughter-in-law who loves you is more to you than 7 sons has borne him. So it's Naomi who takes the child and lays her on her bosom and becomes his nurse. So this is a complete turnaround for Naomi. Remember, she reckoned, I don't have babies inside me. And even if I did, you couldn't wait. Well, now she has this child, who is Ruth's child, who is now counted as her child, and she becomes his nurse. And it's the woman who give him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So that's the story of Ruth. Just a few things to kind of fill it out a little bit. One is that when they bless Ruth when she gets married to Boaz, they say, may you be like the matriarchs of Israel. And they also mention Tamar. We read the story of Tamar in chapter 37 of Genesis. And she's an interesting kind of a counterfoil to Ruth. Tamar was a Canaanite, so also a despised outsider. Tamar had to look after herself by dressing up as a prostitute so that her father-in-law would sleep with her to give her a child. In those days, what happened was if your husband died, it was then his brother's responsibility to give you a child. And 2 of Judah's children had already died, so he said, I don't know, this woman's bad luck, I'm not giving my youngster to her. And so the only way that Tamar can survive is she has to gamble on the fact that Judah, her father-in-law, will sleep with a prostitute. So she plays the prostitute. The very end of the book of Ruth, it gives the genealogy of David, beginning with Tamar's child. So, what can we say about all of that? Some thoughts on the meanings of this story. So, the one thing I want to stress is the reason Scripture uses story is because story is powerful and story speaks in different ways. You can never read a story and say, oh, so what does that mean? As if the story is the wrapper and there's a meaning inside it, and you can unwrap the story and take out the meaning. The story is the meaning. But as we read that story, what are some of the many meanings that emerge from it? For me, my first question there is it a theodicy? Does anyone know what a theodicy is? A theodicy is a way of trying to justify God. How do we explain why there is suffering in the world? And one thing we have very clearly here is Naomi has a particular way of understanding suffering. Naomi has interpreted the fact that, well, when she went to Moab, she might have thought, is this the right thing to do or not? She's interpreted her suffering as God's anger against her. But what does God actually do in the story? Well, literally, as I've said, the only thing we know he does is he gives a child to Ruth. But we've seen how what Naomi says about God changes, and how she realizes that the kindness of God has continued to be with her. So, what does the book of Ruth say about why we suffer? It certainly seems to say, don't go for that convenient, you did something wrong, now God is punishing you. So it's maybe a theodicy on its head. The other thing is that word kindness, did you hear how often that came up? The Hebrew word is chesed, which is sometimes translated as steadfast love or loving kindness. It's covenant faithfulness. It's the kindness and the generosity and the love and the commitment that comes from the fact that you are in relationship. All of these people in the story are in relationship with God, but it's really interesting to see how that kindness and generosity and love and mercy of God was experienced. For Naomi, she experienced it through Ruth, through a foreigner. Ruth's commitment was to Naomi. And because of her deep love for Naomi, she was willing to worship Naomi's God. She wasn't like, oh, I just love this God and I want to worship this God. She says, I'm staying with you. And if that means worshiping your God, being buried with your people, so be it. The chesed there is a human commitment, a daughter-in-law to a mother-in-law. And this is a mother-in-law who had sunk, it appears, so much into depression that she wasn't able to give to her daughter-in-law love and affirmation. But her daughter-in-law stuck with her. Ruth is an incredible example of covenant faithfulness. I said toward the beginning that some people say that this is a story without a villain. Does anyone think there may be a villain in the story? There's danger in the story. I think, she wouldn't have used the word. I think Naomi was almost going to make God the villain, but she wasn't. She was making herself the guilty one. So she wasn't, but that didn't work because God wasn't. But do you see here how the whole social setup left Naomi and Ruth very, very vulnerable? We have it with the kind of just the lurking danger. She's obeying the law because the law said that the poor are allowed to glean. But there were young men in the field, and you couldn't be too sure that they wouldn't take advantage of her, especially since she's just a Moabite woman. So you have that low regard for women, the vulnerability of women. And we can't get around the fact that the way Ruth, just as Tamar did before her, the way Ruth has to work for salvation is by playing the prostitute. In a society such as this one, the vulnerability of the woman meant that they had to find ways to survive. You could survive by gleaning, but what do you do when the harvest is over? And so you have, so is it a story without a villain? I'd say the whole the social setup is perhaps the villain. Most scholars agree that the book of Ruth was written in the post-exilic period. So don't worry too much about the post-exilic period unless you want to ask me questions on it. Except that the period when the people had come back from exile was a period in which they were asking, how is it that we can be the true people of God in such a way that we never again end up being defeated by our enemies? And so you've got books like the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I don't know if you know much about Nehemiah. He's famous for building a wall around Jerusalem. And he builds a wall in more than one way. There was a really strong sense that in order to be the holy people of God, we need to stay separate. We need to make sure that we are in no way contaminated by those outsiders. So much that both Ezra and Nehemiah ordered Jewish people who had married foreigners to divorce them and send them away with their children. So, in this post-exilic period, there was this whole thing about what does it mean to be the pure, holy people of God? And one of the answers was, you need to keep yourself separate, you need to keep yourself holy. And another answer is given by the storyteller of Ruth, probably also the storyteller of the book of Jonah, which does it in a different way. And the reminder in the book of Ruth is, be very careful about defining ourselves over against. Because how does God bring life and hope and healing into Naomi's life? Through Ruth the Moabite. And not only that, how does God kind of bring about the birth of David, who's described as a person after God's own heart? Well, Ruth is one of his ancestors. And so this story is what I've called there a post-exilic challenge to exclusivism. It's saying be very careful about trying to be too holy. Remember that the covenant faithfulness of God, the salvation of God, worked through Ruth the Moabite. And then finally, perhaps just to think of this as an Advent journey. Why an Advent journey? Well, in Advent, we're journeying toward Bethlehem. So to think of Naomi's journey. Naomi, she travels to Bethlehem, but she needs to be there for a while before she actually discovers it again as the house of bread, the house of plenty. If Naomi can move from bitterness, depression, guilt, just that kind of lethargy that she didn't even seem to notice how hard and how dismissive she was being of Ruth. If she can move from that to where we ended up, which was her sitting with the baby on her lap and everybody celebrating with her. I suppose my encouragement to you in this Advent journey is be wherever you are at the beginning of the journey, but with the help of God, the God who is not judging, the God who is not condemning or punishing, the God who is providing a Ruth, take that journey to actually discover the life and the hope that awaits us in Bethlehem. And if you're a Ruth, just to know that by being committed to those around us, by loving the people who need our love, by doing whatever it takes to survive, be open to the fact that as you're doing that, God could be working in and through you to bring about hope. And I do hope that all of you, in some way or other, will experience that joy that Naomi experienced at the birth of a baby. There's something about the birth of a child, physical, literal, or metaphorical. I do hope that in your Advent journey, you will discover, to your surprise, the new thing that God is doing. And if you think like Naomi, I'm too old for this, well, God can surprise you and be a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jessie. Would you be willing to take questions?
Please, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. That was, when you read the story superficially, it's a scheming old thing, but then that's a... But the very important word in that story is kinsman. Naomi knew that Boaz had an obligation to her, because if somebody's family fell on hard time, lost everything, they had to be rescued. So he had a duty to rescue Ruth, and the best way was to marry her. But then redeem is rescue, and our understanding of redemption was ransom, bargain, and it's quite different. Jesus redeemed us to bring us in the family, to bring humanity in the family. And Boaz redeemed Ruth, and she becomes part of this family, being great-grandmother to David. And that was explained in my study Bible, because I had no idea why would he marry a cousin, but now I understood the meaning of redemption, and it really moved me very deeply.
Thank you. That is central to the story of Ruth, that idea of redemption, the idea of being a kinsman. I think that what probably would have happened is it was clear that Boaz had some sort of an obligation to Naomi. When you go and bring in a Moabite widow, then the question is, does he have any obligation to a Moabite widow? And which is why it took him so long, because he probably thought he didn't. And Naomi was way too old to marry. So, but kinsman, the idea of being brought again into a family, and that incredible word redemption. More literal here in that it's a kind of a buying back. He had to buy back a field. When it's used of God, when it's used of Jesus, I think that's also the Exodus story that's there, where God takes on the power of the empire to set the people free. God setting the slaves free is also part of the meaning of redemption. I see a light on now, so it's probably working.
Okay, this boom. Just wanted to not too close. Okay. So just firstly, thanking you for a really rich exposition of something that I've only really read summaries of, and so it's amazing depth that's in there. In addition to what you've mentioned, it seems apparent to me, I don't know if other people have made this observation, that it seems to be talking about the power of adoption. So we are all adopted sons and daughters of the Father. That's our routine. So maybe this is a kind of an archetype, a precursor to that possibility. So within the Hebrew tradition, and it seems it's one of my questions is how early is this? How key is this to the Jewish psyche at Jesus' time and now? And also, I think that's a big enough question to ask.
Yes. So how important a story is it in Jesus' time? Well, it's interesting that when Matthew puts together the genealogy at the beginning of his gospel, he chooses Tamar, Ruth, Bathsheba, Rahab at the beginning, and then Mary. So it's very, very clear that for the early Christians, the fact that this is part of Jesus' story was very, very, very clear at that stage. In Judaism today, it's a greatly loved story. As I say, it's one of the 5. It's read at one of these pilgrimage festivals. So people know the story. The name Ruth is often given or taken on by someone who becomes, who converts to Judaism. So there is Ruth is greatly loved. But yes, it's a story of our own adoption. I'm busy teaching Paul at the moment, so just reminded again how much of a big deal it was that non-Jewish people, without becoming Jews, could become part of the people of God, part of those who follow Jesus. So I think it's a really special story.
2 questions online.
Mm-hmm.
The first one is Ruth's action towards Boaz manipulative?
Is Ruth's action toward Boaz manipulative? She and Naomi both know they need to push him. So yes, I guess it is. It is the kind of action, though, taken by a woman without power. So she has no power, but what she can do is she knows he likes her, or Naomi knows. So I suppose it is manipulative, but it's also very, very dangerous. Because the easiest thing, threshing floor after the harvest, he could have slept with her and sent her away. So manipulative, yeah, but she's gambling on his good character.
And the next one is Ruth a picture of the church, a Jewish redeemer from Bethlehem with a Gentile bride?
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, I think that's a powerful symbolic reading of it. Except, fortunately, our Redeemer, we don't have to go to such lengths. So, I suppose I wouldn't want to make Boaz the Christ figure. I'd want to see. We speak about God was in Christ. I'd rather say Christ was in God, in the Lord, kind of working behind the scenes through it all. But maybe.
Mine is a comment. I actually think this is a very powerful story for our times, because we live in times when we are returning to nationalism, to xenophobia. This was what worried Naomi about her disloyalty. She's rewarded with loyalty, and the loyalty that bears fruit. So I think it's a very powerful story. It's also a reminder that if you take Tamar and Ruth and Mary, we have 3 vulnerable women whose vulnerability makes them all the more special to give. I'm a doctor by background, but the female mitochondria is the energy source that the Almighty uses to allow flesh, the Word to be made flesh. And I think it's a powerful story of arrival in a foreign land, and what, if you don't expect, or if you walk through with love and generosity, the returns that one brings.
Thank you. And you've captured it so beautifully there. And just to stress again, I agree with you that we need to hear these kind of stories where, and I suppose now I'm speaking as a South African, nationalism and Christian nationalism, and this idea of, we need to keep Europe Christian by what? By being completely and utterly unchristlike. Yeah. So it's, and as well, the vulnerability and the power of women. And to those women, I'm now thinking of Matthew's Gospel, you can also add Rahab, who was an innkeeper, stroke prostitute, and Bathsheba, who is, I know people say like, oh, how much agency did she have? She was raped by David.
A couple of comments. Firstly, I think that Ruth gives us a beautiful invitation from the Lord as Gentiles to how we treat the Jewish people. Ruth's commitment to her Jewish mother-in-law brought about all this blessing that led to Christ. And I think there's a hint for us there of how we might respond. The other thing is that Boaz's granddad would have told him the story that the Jews know, but we have forgotten. We know the story of Moses coming to the Red Sea and the Red Sea parting, but the Jews tell it slightly differently. In the Talmud, Moses holds up the staff and nothing happens. But Boaz's grandfather, Nahshon, steps into the water and steps into the water and steps in one more step and he's dead. He steps in and then the waves part. And Boaz would have grown up knowing this story that sometimes you have to make a way in danger to bring about the miracle. So when he sees this girl at his feet, there is something in him that would have remembered she's taking a real risk here. She's stepping into danger in order to bring about a miracle. And I think that maybe had an influence on how he responded. He's a holy man, but I think that would have helped him. So, but thank you.
Thank you. I didn't know that tradition about Nahshon.
Yeah.
That's powerful. And can I just say what you said there about how we relate to our Jewish brothers and sisters? One thing I read a while back, which has profoundly changed the way I think, is the fact that we too often think about hospitality as something that we can give. So we have, and to be Christian is to be hospitable to others. But this is Willie James Jennings is the theologian. What he was saying is, can you imagine if the church hadn't gone down the triumphalist route of thinking, we've superseded Judaism, and instead had constantly recognized the incredible privilege that there is space in their story for us. So in other words, that we become the recipients of hospitality. And then he goes on to speak about like the missionaries going to the New World. Imagine if they arrived in South America, aware that they carry the gospel and are totally dependent on the hospitality of others. I think what would have been communicated then would have been much closer to the fullness and the richness of the gospel. So there is something about to recognize the privilege that we have, that there is space in the Jewish story made for us.
There's another question here. How would you place in perspective Ruth's attitude to her mother-in-law, even though a Gentile or one whose tribe is detested?
Okay, like what I'm doing, obviously, is I'm filling in the gaps. You know, as I've read the story, kind of, so I can't say that it is this way, but these are the kind of things I notice. That Naomi speaks about the generosity and the kindness she's experienced from Ruth. She's quite happy for them to go, they start the journey together. It's only as she gets closer to Bethlehem that she starts to say, hang on, no way. So it seems to me that there's this very close bond between Ruth and Naomi, that Ruth then probably is able to recognize her mother-in-law's depression, grief, whatever. But she says, what did she say? You know, she wants to be, sorry, she's committed to Naomi. So I think, look, she's been her daughter-in-law for over 10 years. She loves Naomi, and she will journey with Naomi. She'll forgive her for that. Have I understood the question?
Thank you.
A quick question, really. When you said about Boaz, you don't want Boaz to be a Christ figure, but it does occur to me that really the whole thing is the other way around, because even now we still look for the Messianic Christ. And when are we going to really recognize the suffering servant? It's just sort of difficult. And of course, we've got all these broken people down the line to show how the Lord works. Yeah. But we still really don't learn.
So can Ruth be the Christ figure? And Naomi the one in need of redemption? The thing about kind of symbolic or typographical readings like that is often there's a piece of the story which captures something powerfully. And we don't have to then try and make all the pieces fit, because then it starts, then it's like, can it be this, can it be that? So the pieces that you notice which resonate strongly, hold on to those and ignore me when I say, oh, but what about? Because you're saying it's this piece of the story. And I think if you think about how the Spirit of God is at work in the world, I think in so many different characters you can see something of the Spirit of Christ at work.
Online. Thank you very much for such a wonderful exposition of the story and drawing out so many different aspects. I love that final thought. You don't have to deal with the whole thing all the time. Just take a little piece. So I'll take that with me as I look at the scriptures this Advent and just say, which little bit resonates today, now? And I'll stick with that. So thank you very much, Jessie.
Thank you.
Are you going to...
Yeah. And I'm very sorry, I was supposed to start with an opening prayer and pray for you at the beginning. So we will close with a prayer now. Perhaps we can say a glory be together and just ask God's blessing on Jessie for the work that she does, particularly around Scripture, which is so important, and we've really appreciated your talk tonight. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. There are refreshments in the first committee room. If you would like to make a donation to our continuing programme of Emmaus Talks, we have a full series next year, and your parishes already have the leaflets, so they'll be putting them out soon if they haven't done so already. So if you would like to make a contribution, there are some baskets sitting by Fr Jerome there. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you. Hold on.
I watch the sunrise, lighting the sky, casting its shadows near. And on this morning, bright though it be, I feel those shadows near me. But you are always close to me, following all my ways. May I be always close to you, following all your ways, Lord.
I watch the sunlight shine through the clouds, warming the earth below. And at the midday, life seems to say, I feel your brightness near me.
For you are always close to me, following all my ways. May I be always close to you, following all your ways, Lord. I watch the sunset fading away, lighting the clouds with speed. And as the evening closes its eyes, I feel your presence near me. For you are always close to me, following all my ways. May I be always close to you, following all your ways, Lord.
I watch the moonlight guarding the night, waiting till morning comes.
The air is silent, earth is at rest, only your peace is near me. For you are always close to me, following all my ways. May I be always close to you, following all your ways, Lord.
And he will raise you up on eagle's wings, bear you on the breath of dawn, make you to shine like the sun, and hold you in the palm of his hand. be changed, renewed, flowing from the grace that I found in you. And Lord, I've come to know the weaknesses I see in me will be stripped away by the power of your love.